Hello. Undoubtedly, you've heard about the controversy surrounding the atomic bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, most of the controversy surrounds the fact that all these people died, and for what? But I am going to tell you tonight that the nuclear bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary, both militarily and politically in the end. My claims to support this are: the bombings ultimately saved more lives than they took. The second bombing was necessary to secure a Japanese surrender. The bombings were primarily used for their psychological effect on the Japanese population rather than their destructive effect. And the nuclear strikes established a U.S. creditable strategic deterrent against the Soviet Union in the opening days of the Cold War. Coming back to my first claim, the bombings ultimately saved more lives than they took. Up till this point in the war, the Japanese had been in the habit of denying quarter and refusing to surrender to U.S. forces, resulting in high casualties for them and U.S. forces fighting them. In the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese had been showing a habit of involving this local civilian population in the battle, also resulting in a high loss rate for those civilians. At Okinawa, about a third of all civilians on the island died in the battle. Furthermore, coming back to the Japanese preferred not to surrender or accept U.S. surrenders, in the Battle of Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese troops were killed and over 50,000 U.S. forces were casualties in the battle. Following on to this, to secure a Japanese surrender without the nuclear weapons, the U.S. would have had to conventionally invade the islands of Japan. If this had happened, the high numbers of Japanese troops on the islands and their previous inclinations not to accept surrender or give it would have resulted in equally high rates of casualties for U.S. forces. A study conducted for the Secretary of War by a Stanford professor anticipated about 400 to 800,000 U.S. deaths in any invasion of the islands, and about 5 to 10 million Japanese casualties, because civilians are also included in that number. To give you a sense of that, the preliminary estimates for the battles in the opening days were about 500,000. The manufacturer for Purple Hearts manufactured about that many to be ready to give to U.S. soldiers that were either killed or wounded. Up till today, those Purple Hearts are still being used. We haven't actually had that many casualties in all wars after that combined, including Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We're still using them. Then some people like to question, why drop a second bomb? One bomb was enough, right? Well, the second bombing was necessary because it did establish that the U.S. was capable of making more than just one of these bombs, and in fact could make many more. For all the Japanese knew, the U.S. could be dropping one every day. It also dispelled Japanese rumors that this explosion in Hiroshima was not a U.S. attack, but some sort of regular accident, like a fuel dump explosion, which was actually something that the Japanese Department of War was attempting to disseminate to the military. Thirdly, the bombings were primarily used for their shock and awe factor. That is, it's more of the horror that this one city could be destroyed in one instant instead of actually creating deaths by themselves. Up till that point in the war, the U.S. had already been sending bombers over the Japanese mainland for quite some time, thanks to capturing air bases near the Japanese islands. B-29s had already been in the habit of firestorming regular Japanese cities constructed primarily of wood. These had high casualty rates just through conventional bombs. In Operation Meeting House in Tokyo, in one night 100,000 Japanese were killed and over 1 million were left homeless. This is more than either one of the nuclear strikes by themselves. In addition, the combined fire bombings of Japanese cities throughout the war resulted in ultimately about 300,000 to 400,000 casualties to the Japanese. This is more than, say, the long-term effects that people like to bring up of Hiroshima bombings, such as leukemia, radiation poisoning, cancers, things like that. Finally, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were generally untouched by these conventional bombing raids. The U.S. Air Force wanted to know exactly what a nuclear bomb would do to a city that had no damage inflicted upon it by a regular bomb. So, for the most part, U.S. bombs did not drop on these two cities. So, most of the people that were killed in these bombing raids might have been killed anyway by regular bombs if these atomic bombs were not dropped. Finally, the nuclear strikes established a credible U.S. deterrent in the opening days of the Cold War. The Soviet Union at this point did not have a nuclear bomb of their own. They did not. They were not seriously pursuing them either. However, the bombings showed that the U.S. did have these bombs and did have the capability of dropping them out of an airplane to deliver onto a military or civilian target. The Soviet Union did not have a bomb until about a year or two after this. However, this also established the footing for the later days of the Cold War, the principle of mutually assured destruction, which indicates that neither side can really go to war with each other directly, because this would create a situation where both sides could use nuclear weapons on the other. After this, the Soviet Union did not really intervene in U.S. affairs such as Korea and Vietnam, largely because of this. So, in conclusion, the nuclear bombings were necessary, mainly because of they, in the end, preserved lives, even though they did take many in the first place. They did in fact need 2 bombs, not 1, to secure the Japanese surrender. They were primarily used for psychological value, not harm, and did establish a U.S. deterrent in the opening days of the Cold War. Thank you.
All right, you do identify the proposition. It has 2 parts to it, so it's bifurcated there. That's a little problematic. The secondary issues are laid out. A couple of them, though, are not really phrased as claims, so you want to make sure that you are consistent on that. There's a pretty good explanation about the controversy, although you mostly assume that the audience is familiar with it. I thought you explained the background pretty well. The secondary points, as you got to them, they were labeled pretty well, although I didn't hear a very clear transition to that second point. The first and the third points were a little bit sharper. Some of the evidence that you presented, you had some factual data and some statistics about particular battles, for instance, Okinawa, or the bombing of the one meeting that you were talking about, the meeting bombing. I think that that's good information, although I should get a source citation on that. We got source citations on the estimates about American casualties and Japanese casualties should an invasion occur. You present some information as factual data about Japanese policies on surrender, and I think you could probably find some contemporaneous authorities that you could cite on that, although I don't know how much dispute there is on it. It would be a little bit more convincing if we got the historical reference on those points. The delivery is pretty strong for the most part. I think you do a good job talking to the audience, and I thought you had a good summary at the end. I do think that the argument about long-term deterrence of the Soviet Union and the connection to MAD is underdeveloped. It gets tossed in at the end, and if you're going to be making a claim about lives, for instance, being saved as a consequence of the deterrence of any kind of larger war, you needed to develop that argument a little bit more instead of making it just like a minor point on your last exit point. I think that it needs to be more convincing. And in fact, that could in fact be the whole point of the argument if you wanted. All right, thank you.